Hey guys, how you doing? It's Tom. I'm sure by now you've already heard about Count Dankula, but for those of you not familiar, let's do a quick overview. Count Dankula is a YouTube comedian, and a few years ago he was watching his girlfriend's dog while she was away for the weekend or the week, whatever it was, and his girlfriend thought this dog was the sweetest little thing in the world, an angel sent down from heaven. So he thought it would be a great joke to make the dog into the most vile, grotesque thing he could think of. A Nazi. So while she was on vacation, and he filmed this and put it on YouTube, because he's a comedian, he trained this dog to raise its paw when he said Hail Hitler, and to raise its paw when he said Gas the Jews. Now anyone who doesn't have a stick up their ass knows this is hilarious. But unfortunately, the government of Britain does in fact have a stick up their ass. So, under the new laws that prohibit hate speech in Britain, he was charged with the crime, and this week he was convicted, and I believe he faces 6 months to 1 year in prison for making a parody joke video on YouTube. Think about how terrifying that is. Now, obviously, people all over YouTube, all over the internet, all over the alternative press, I'm sure even the mainstream media, have come to his defense, and really the defense of free speech, because without free speech, how do we introduce people to new arguments? If the government determines what hate speech is, then the government can say anything that goes against the positions they're trying to put forward, their agenda, is hate speech, and people won't be exposed to these new arguments. So people came to the defense of free speech. And I found it very disturbing because I think people did a bad job of framing the argument. Because much of the framing in defense of Count Dankula was that what he put out was a joke. And this is very dangerous because it seeds in people's minds that, oh yeah, well, he shouldn't be in prison because what he did was a joke. But if he was truly guilty of wrongthink, or if he truly had grotesque belief system, if he thought the Nazis were a great party, then he should be locked up. You're seeding that in their mind by framing the argument that he should have speech because it's a joke. This is wrong. Even if he trained the dog to hail Hitler because he thought Hitler was great, even if he trained the dog to raise its paw when he says gas the Jews because he thought Hitler's gassing of the Jews was great, we have to defend that. Because if we don't have free speech, then the inevitable result will be groups of people being gassed by the next Hitler. You always have to assume when you're giving the government power over something that your worst enemy, your worst possible nightmare will take that power and abuse it 10 times worse than anything, than any intention of giving the government power to prevent people from being hurt, if that makes sense. You have to assume the power will be abused. And a great example we recently saw of this coming from the government Britain is with Lawrence Southern. Britain passed the 2000 Terrorism Act, I believe that's what it's called, or 2000 Terrorist Act, in which the government gained power to combat radical Islamic terrorism, playing into people's fear, saying we need to stop these radicals from coming over the border, and if they do, we are going to give the police sweeping powers in which they can deny people basic due process, they can deny people their right to an attorney. We have to do this. We have to be able to act fast, because if we don't, who knows, bombs could go off, people could get shot, planes could fly into buildings. Well, we saw just 2 weeks ago Lawrence Southern, a YouTube journalist who is a Christian conservative libertarian, very typical Western values, was detained trying to enter Britain. Now, the real story, I mean, yes, part of the story is that she was detained and denied entry. But the troubling part of the story is that she was held under the 2000 Terrorist Act, which means she was denied access to an attorney. her basic civil liberties were taken away from her by an act that was sold to the public as being used to combat terrorism. So when you give the government certain powers, it's eventually going to expand that power and use it against people who it wasn't the original intention for it to be used against. So if we give the government power to throw people in prison for making jokes on YouTube, then we're giving the government the power to throw people in prison for whatever. And if we're giving the government the power to throw people in jail for having wrongthink, for thinking the Nazis were great, then what happens when the next Nazi-type leader takes power? And in a way, this is already taking place in Britain. Because if you look at what's happening there, they no longer have free speech, right? Because now people are being prosecuted for hate speech. Count Dankula makes a video joking about Nazis, and he's facing a year in prison. And don't think everyone else in the country doesn't see that when they think, oh, I might want to speak against this group or that group. It's not about Nazis, right? When the Nazis come into power, you do realize the people in Nazi Germany, they didn't think they were the bad guys, right? Hitler sold that as the Jews had persecuted the people of Germany, and the people of Germany were just defending themselves against the Jews, right? So these people thought they were in the right. The authoritarian regime, the fascist regime, doesn't tell the public we're fascist. No, they just do fascist things, like silence political opposition, like deny people freedom of speech. Where are we seeing that? They're not going to say they're fascist. But in Britain, Dankula is silenced, and Lauren Southern has her basic liberty. She's denied access to an attorney trying to enter the country because the government claims that having conservative, libertarian Christian values is apparently equal to being a terrorist threat. Although Lauren Southern has hours and hours and hours over years of videos on YouTube which she always speaks against violence, she always condemns violence, and she's never called for violence. So they damn well knew she wasn't a terrorist, but they held her under the Terrorist Act anyway. And of course the people in Britain also don't have gun rights. And if you look at what's happening in Britain, first they voted for Brexit, and now that's not happening. The government has essentially ignored the referendum, ignored the will of the people to leave the European Union. And if there's a referendum held to exit the European Union, and the people of Britain vote for that referendum that they want out of the European Union, and then they're denied the ability to exit the European Union, they are now, by de facto, by logic, they are essentially an occupied nation. They are occupied by Brussels. They are ruled by the bureaucrats who control the European Union. They don't have basic liberty. They're not a free country. Britain is occupied. Well, take that a step further. Last week, the Telford grooming scandal broke. And basically what's happening is that thousands and thousands of young girls over decades have been captured, groomed, subjected to rape and subjected to sex slavery along with torture. We're talking about brutal stuff. We're talking about girls being held down and raped by 50 men at once. We're talking about girls being gang raped. We're talking about 10, 12-year-old girls being gang raped by gangs of grown 30, 40-year-old men. And it's not just rape. They're having their tongues nailed into boards. They're having petroleum poured all over their body. Because it's not even just about the rape, it's about taking their power, taking their innocence. Their innocence is being raped and taken from them. And if you look at the statistics, over 80%, and that's a low number, of the people doing the grooming are of Muslim descent. And by Muslim, we mean most of them subscribe to the religion of peace. The religion of Islam, which, although there are people that do follow it peacefully, there are very large segments which follow the radical, to-the-letter version of Sharia law, that type of Islam. So you have over 80%, and and I've seen numbers estimated as high as 95, that these rapes, this sex slavery, is being committed on a mass scale, being ignored by authorities for political correctness. And if you speak up about this, this is where Tommy Robinson broke onto the scene originally. This is what he said was happening. He said, why is no one talking about this? Why aren't the police doing anything about this? And of course, now the story breaks. And the government, again, considers Tommy Robinson a terrorist for bringing this up. Factual information that 80-90% of this grooming is taking place of people of Muslim descent. But Tommy Robinson had been thrown in jail for that. Lauren Southern's tried to draw attention to that, and she's been thrown in jail. So the government has an agenda to flood and really, see, the European Union, which Britain's not allowed to leave, has an agenda, which you can look up, the Migrant Replacement Solution, the UN, which was brought up in the UN in the year 2000, to flood Western countries with people from the Middle East, because that will help in the plan of creating more totalitarian systems, right? Because people from these countries will vote for bigger and bigger government to take away basic liberties, because that's more in line with Sharia law, more in line with using the government, using democracy to dictate, to create an authoritarian type society. So you have this going on, and anyone who tries to speak up against it, now under the guise of protecting people from hate speech, can be arrested. So people are unable to even bring up the problem to fight back against it, to say, hey, we want to control our borders. We need to stop this mass immigration, this influx of immigration coming from the Middle East, because our country is being taken over through demographics. And this isn't to say there's not tons and tons of peaceful Muslims, but a people have a right to protect their society, and there's multiple ways of being conquered. You could be conquered through war, or you could be conquered through bureaucracy. The European Union denying you the ability to exit, and then the people from Brussels creating a migrant replacement solution plan and flooding your borders with people from the Middle East to take away your basic liberties and overrun your country. That's what's happening in Britain right now. But people try to speak up against this, and they're thrown in prison. So you can't even draw attention to the situation. And just look at the spike in violent crimes in Britain. There has been tremendous spikes in rape, in acid attacks, in armed robberies, and home invasions, and these type of crimes. But if people speak about them, because the spike is largely due to the influx of people from the Middle East, then you could be arrested. And if people try to protect themselves, right, they're not allowed to carry guns. So they can't protect themselves against rape, against this type of violence. And there's been stories of men who have known where their daughters were being held as sex slaves in the UK. They go to the authorities. They say, my daughter is being held against her will as a sex slave. My 10-year-old daughter is being raped daily by 10, 20, 30 men. Grown men holding her down and raping her. Please stop this. And the authorities arrest the man for bringing it up, rather than arresting the men for doing the rape. Because the government's allowing this, and the man, he's forced to go to the authorities because he doesn't have a gun. Because me, if that were my child, I would show up where my daughter was being held, or my son was being held, and either I was walking out with my child, and there's going to be a lot of dead people, or I was going to be dead and my child was going to be dead. But this idea that the government would just ignore me and throw me in prison, and you can look this stuff, this is really happening. So the right to free speech, the right to bear arms, are gone in Britain. They had a referendum, they tried to leave the European Union, and they're not allowed to. So they don't really have any say over the government. They're being ruled by bureaucrats in Brussels. This is what's happening in the West, and we have to pay attention in America, because this is going to happen here. Because look at YouTube cracking down on hate speech. It's the same model they're using in the European Union. It's just in, the European Union, in Britain. But we have the Constitution, we have freedom of speech. But they're using it through the internet companies. We need to combat hate speech. Well, who's deciding what hate speech is? The oligarchy is, the ruling class is, the government decides what hate speech is. And they're aggressively attacking our gun rights. Look how they used the Parkland students. They rolled them out. CNN had a town hall. They didn't let pro-Second Amendment students attend the town hall. But they had all of these anti-gun students to play on the emotions of the country, to push for gun bans, to push for confiscations of semi-automatic rifles. And who knows where it goes from there. But just the other day, we saw Great Mills High School. They had a shooting, and the shooter opened fire, and within 1 minute, an armed security officer at the school sprinted down the hallway, engaged the shooter, and killed the shooter. And saved who knows how many lives. Probably saved 15, 20, 30 lives. And is CNN holding a town hall for that? No, because there's an agenda being pushed from the top to take away the free speech and to take away the guns. And we need to look at what's happening in Britain. And when we defend free speech, we can't defend it as, oh, well, it was a joke. No, 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 no. We have to defend it as even Nazis should have the right to free speech. Because they don't say, oh, we need to take away the free speech, your free speech. No, they say, we find the most grotesque people we could find. We take away their speech. And then just like the 2000 Terrorist Act, which got Lauren Southern, had her basic civil liberties taken away, her ability to have a lawyer taken away. Just like that, we take the most grotesque people, we take away their right to free speech, then we extend the definition of whose speech we could take away, and we take away everyone's speech. So now if you try to criticize what's happening with the European Union, with the immigration policy, they say you're not criticizing the immigration policy, you're criticizing the religion of Islam, this is hate speech, you can't do that, we're throwing you in prison. And if your daughter's being raped, you can't go to the authorities because we'll throw you in prison. And you can't go get her out because you can't have a gun. We need to wake up to what's happening in the West. Because if we don't, if we keep falling for this bullshit, this fascism, we are being infiltrated with fascism. These unelected bureaucracies in the deep state, in the CIA, the FBI, operating outside of the law. We will stand up against fascism, or we will fall victim to it under the guise of protecting us from fascism and taking away our speech, taking away our gun rights, taking away our privacy rights, taking away our rights to fair trials. There's a lot of history involved in this stuff, and it's very difficult to understand. And I know the people that follow me have a very good understanding of history, and I learned so much from you guys in the comments. So please let me know what you think. But we need to wake people up and let them know what's happening. We have to stand up for free speech, no matter whose speech it is. We have to stand up for gun rights. We have to stand up for privacy rights. We have to stand up for fair trials. Because if we don't, the West will fall. Thank you so much, guys. Tom Anderson on Gab, TomFFRnews on Twitter, Tom Anderson on Facebook, FFRnews on Facebook, Tom Anderson on Steemit, Patreon, www.patreon.com/FFRnews. Thanks, guys.